The clinking of champagne flutes and the low hum of self-congratulatory chatter filled the opulent conference hall. It was the annual Alden Rowe Holdings shareholder meeting, a celebration of another year of purported record profits. At the gleaming mahogany table on the dais sat Marcus Alden, CEO, radiating predatory charm, and beside him, David Fletcher, CFO, his expression a carefully constructed mask of fiscal responsibility. They were the kings of their gilded castle, lauded by the very people they were systematically fleecing. Hidden amongst the sea of expensive suits and designer dresses, a lone figure watched them with an unnervingly calm intensity. Eleanor Vance. To the casual observer, she was just another face in the crowd, perhaps a junior analyst from a lesser firm or a curious business journalist. Her simple, dark pantsuit was a stark contrast to the peacocking display around her, but it was chosen for camouflage, not modesty. Her dark hair, once a soft cascade, was now cut in a severe practical bob. Her eyes, though, were the most changed. The warm, trusting light that once shone in them had been extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard glitter of tempered steel. 7 years. 7 years. 3 months. And 12 days it had been. 7 years since Marcus and David, her boss and her supposed friend, had smiled at her with those same faces while simultaneously plunging a knife deep into her back. 7 years since they'd orchestrated her downfall, framing her for an embezzlement scheme so audacious it had made headlines, all to cover their own much larger, far more insidious operation. 7 years she'd lost. First to the shock and the rigged trial, then to the brutal, soul-crushing reality of Danbury Federal Correctional Institution. But Danbury had done more than just punish. It had forged her. In the bleakness of her cell, fueled by a rage so pure it was almost a physical entity, Eleanor Vance, the diligent, perhaps slightly naive chief accountant, had died. In her place, a phoenix had begun to stir, one with an encyclopedic knowledge of forensic accounting, a mind like a steel trap, and a singular, all-consuming purpose: vengeance. Not petty revenge, but a reckoning so thorough it would dismantle their empire and leave them with nothing but the ashes of their deceit. Eleanor remembered the good old days at Alden Rowe with a bitter taste. She'd been their star, Marcus Alden's whiz kid, recruited straight out of grad school. Her meticulous nature and uncanny ability to make sense of the most convoluted spreadsheets had quickly propelled her up the ranks. Marcus was the charismatic visionary, full of grand pronouncements and infectious enthusiasm. David, older, quieter, had been the steady hand, the one Eleanor often turned to for advice, believing him a mentor. They had been a team, or so she'd thought. "Ellie, you're indispensable," Marcus would boom, clapping her on the shoulder, his smile wide and disarming. "What would we do without you?" David, in his more subdued way, would echo. "Your attention to detail, Eleanor. It's what keeps this ship sailing true." She'd basked in their praise, blind to the subtle undercurrents. The way Marcus would casually approve expenses that seemed exorbitant, even for their high-flying firm. The way David would sometimes deflect her more pointed questions about certain offshore accounts with a vague, "That's Marcus's special project. Above your pay grade for now, Ellie, but trust me. It's all legit." Trust. That had been her fatal flaw. She'd trusted them implicitly. Why wouldn't she? They'd given her opportunities, responsibility, and what she'd mistaken for respect. The first inkling that something was deeply wrong came disguised as a system upgrade. A new proprietary accounting software was implemented, one that Marcus and David championed as state-of-the-art and impenetrable. Eleanor, tasked with overseeing the transition, found it clunky and unnecessarily opaque. Certain transaction pathways were obscured, and access levels were oddly compartmentalized. When she raised concerns, Marcus had charmed her into compliance, while David had assured her it was merely for enhanced security. "We're playing in the big leagues now, Ellie," Marcus had said, his eyes gleaming. "Need to keep our cards close to our chest. Industrial espionage, you know." The truth was far more sinister. The software wasn't designed to keep others out. It was designed to let them siphon funds undetected, creating a ghost ledger that only they controlled. And Eleanor, with her unparalleled access and digital signature, was to be their unwitting scapegoat. The day the auditors arrived, unannounced, was seared into Eleanor's memory. A Tuesday. She'd been reconciling quarterly reports, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach over discrepancies she couldn't quite pin down, discrepancies that had only appeared since the new software rollout. Marcus had been a picture of calm concern, David by his side looking suitably grave. "Eleanor, the auditors have found some irregularities," Marcus had said, his voice laced with feigned disappointment. "Significant ones. Irregularities concerning several large wire transfers," David added, his gaze avoiding hers. "Transfers that appear to have originated from your terminal, authorized with your credentials." Her world tilted. "What? That's impossible. I never authorized any such transfers." But there it was, presented by stern-faced men in grey suits, digital records, seemingly irrefutable, showing millions siphoned off to shell corporations. Her digital signature was on every transaction, her access codes, her life, neatly packaged and handed to them on a silver platter. The ensuing weeks were a blur of accusations, interrogations, and the crushing weight of irrefutable, fabricated evidence. Her protests of innocence were met with pitying looks or outright disbelief. Marcus and David played their parts to perfection. The shocked, betrayed executives who had placed too much trust in a brilliant but ultimately corrupt employee. They even provided a motive. Eleanor, they suggested, had been living beyond her means, a secret gambling habit perhaps. It was a lie so audacious, yet so carefully constructed, that it stuck. The trial was a farce. Her court-appointed lawyer was outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Marcus, on the stand, was a masterclass in feigned sorrow, while David delivered his lines with a chilling precision that painted Eleanor as a cunning manipulator. The jury, presented with the complex web of digital proof, convicted her in less than a day. The judge's words, a grave abuse of trust, a calculated and egregious theft, echoed in the courtroom as he sentenced her to 10 years. Eleanor saw Marcus and David in the gallery. Marcus met her gaze, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. David simply looked away. That was the moment, the last vestiges of her old self shattered. The betrayal was absolute, a cold, hard knot in her chest that would become the nucleus of her resolve. Prison was a brutal awakening. The clang of steel doors, the dehumanizing routines, the constant thrum of barely suppressed violence. The first few months were about survival, about learning the unwritten rules, about hardening herself against the daily degradations. She saw a fellow inmate, an older woman named Maria, who'd been a bookkeeper for a small-time mob outfit, meticulously tracking favors and debts in a tiny, coded notebook. Maria had been framed too, by her own son. "They think we're just numbers, Chica," Maria told her one day, her voice raspy. "Easy to erase, easy to blame. But numbers don't lie. Not if you know how to read them right. You want to get even? Learn their language better than they do." Maria's words planted a seed. Eleanor had always been good with numbers. Now, she would become their master. She devoured every book on accounting she could get her hands on through the prison library, then moved on to law, specifically financial crime. She learned about shell corporations, money laundering typologies, forensic data recovery, and international finance laws. Her cell became her university, her burning sense of injustice, her unwavering professor. She discovered a correspondence course in forensic accounting offered by a state university. It was a long shot, But she applied, her prison record a glaring red flag. Perhaps it was the desperation in her essay, or a sympathetic academic on the admissions board, but she was accepted. She studied relentlessly, every equation, every case study, every legal precedent, a stepping stone towards her goal. Her bunkmates thought she was crazy, poring over dense textbooks late into the night, the dim light straining her eyes. But Eleanor wasn't just studying, she was forging her weapons. By the time she was released on parole after serving 7 years, reduced for good behavior and academic achievement, she wasn't just Eleanor Vance, ex-convict. She was Eleanor Vance, a forensic accountant with a mind honed to a razor's edge, holding a degree she'd earned against all odds. And she had a plan. Re-entry was harsh. The halfway house was grim, parole conditions restrictive. Finding a job, any job, was nearly impossible with her record. But Eleanor wasn't looking for a conventional career. She needed access, information, and a way to operate under the radar. She took a series of menial data entry jobs at temp agencies, deliberately choosing firms that were small, disorganized, and had lax IT security. These weren't her targets, but her training grounds. At night, in tiny, rented rooms, using burner laptops and public Wi-Fi, she practiced her craft, honing her skills in navigating corporate networks, recovering deleted files, and tracing digital footprints. She learned to live in the shadows, a ghost in the machine. Her first real break came from a disgruntled former IT technician from Alden Rowe, a man named Ben, whom she tracked down through old company social media posts. He'd been fired unceremoniously by David Fletcher for raising concerns about the very accounting software that had sealed Eleanor's fate. Ben was bitter, broke, and more than willing to share his knowledge of Alden Rowe's internal systems, including backdoors he'd built as a precaution, in exchange for a small sum Eleanor had painstakingly saved. That system was a Trojan horse from day one. Ben had spat, handing her a flash drive. Fletcher and Alden knew exactly what they were doing. They called it Project Midas Touch internally. Arrogant pricks. Project Midas Touch. The name itself was an insult. Using Ben's information, Eleanor began her digital infiltration of Alden Rowe. It was slow, painstaking work. She had to be meticulous, untraceable. She discovered that the embezzlement she'd been framed for was a drop in the ocean. Marcus and David were running a sophisticated money laundering scheme, funneling illicit funds from a shadowy international clientele through a complex network of offshore accounts and legitimate-looking investments, all managed through the hidden functionalities of their proprietary software. Alden Rowe itself was merely the respectable facade for a massive criminal enterprise. She traced transactions through shell corporations in the Caymans, Panama, Cyprus. She found encrypted communications, deleted invoices that she painstakingly recovered, and a secret, parallel accounting ledger, the real books, hidden deep within their servers. The evidence she compiled was overwhelming, a digital tapestry of their greed and corruption. She saw how they'd used her credentials as a template, creating ghost transactions in her name even long after she was imprisoned, a contingency to muddy the waters if anyone ever looked too closely. There were close calls. Once, a security sweep initiated by David almost detected her presence. She'd had to pull back, erase her tracks, and wait for weeks before cautiously re-entering. Another time, she'd followed David to a clandestine meeting with a known associate of an Eastern European crime syndicate, taking blurry photographs from a distance, her heart pounding against her ribs. The stakes were immense. If caught, she wouldn't just go back to prison. She'd likely disappear. But the thought of Marcus and David, living their luxurious lives, built on her ruin and the defrauding of countless others, spurred her on. She wasn't just fighting for her name anymore. She was fighting for a form of justice that the system had denied her. Finally, after nearly 2 years of relentless, clandestine work, She had it all. A comprehensive dossier, complete with irrefutable proof, transaction logs, recovered emails, offshore account details, even recordings of incriminating conversations David had foolishly conducted over a compromised internal VoIP line. She had enough to not just clear her name, but to bring their entire corrupt edifice crashing down. The upcoming shareholder meeting was the perfect stage. Back in the buzzing conference hall, Eleanor felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The preliminary speeches were winding down. Marcus was now taking the stage for his keynote address, his voice smooth and confident as he painted a glowing picture of Alden Rowe's financial health and future prospects. He spoke of integrity, transparency, and shareholder value. The hypocrisy, so blatant it was almost comical. Eleanor waited for the Q&A session. As per the rules, shareholders could submit questions in advance. She had submitted one under her proxy name. Could the CFO, Mr. Fletcher, provide a more detailed breakdown of the administrative expenses related to offshore subsidiary consolidations, particularly those processed through the Phoenix Initiative software, and explain the due diligence performed on the beneficial owners of these entities? She'd chosen the name Phoenix Initiative carefully. It was the internal code name for one of their most active laundering channels, something only they would recognize. It was her first shot across the bow. When the moderator read her question, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed David Fletcher's face before his professional mask solidified. Marcus, too, seemed momentarily startled. David stepped up to the podium. Ah, yes, an astute question regarding our proprietary financial management tools. The Phoenix Initiative, as you call it, though it's an internal project name, refers to our advanced global asset management platform. All our subsidiaries undergo rigorous due diligence, and our administrative expenses are fully compliant and optimized for shareholder benefit. We can provide a general summary, of course, but the granular details are commercially sensitive. He was smooth, dismissive. Perhaps, Eleanor's voice cut through the room, clear and steady, amplified slightly by the small microphone she'd requested at her seat. You could then explain this. All heads turned. On the massive screens behind Marcus and David, which had been displaying corporate logos and upbeat graphics, a new image appeared. A flowchart. Not just any flowchart, but a meticulously detailed diagram of Alden Rowe's money laundering network, showing shell corporations, transaction routes, and amounts, all leading back to Marcus Alden and David Fletcher. Gasps rippled through the audience. Marcus's smile froze. David went pale. What is the meaning of this? Marcus blustered, signaling frantically to the AV technicians. Shut that down! There's been a technical error. But the technicians seemed unable to comply. Eleanor, with Ben's help, had locked them out. There's no error, Mr. Alden, Eleanor said, rising slowly from her seat, her gaze locking onto his. She began to walk towards the dais, not with aggression, but with an unshakable, almost serene confidence. This is the reality of Alden Rowe. This is Project Midas Touch. And this, the screen changed to show a copy of a damning email between Marcus and David discussing the framing of an overly inquisitive accountant, is how you ensure silence. Panic began to erupt. Shareholders were shouting. Reporters, smelling blood, were already live streaming. This woman is delusional! Security! David shrieked, his composure finally shattering. Delusional? Eleanor countered, now standing directly in front of them, her voice never rising but cutting through the din. Was it delusional when you, Miss Fletcher, instructed your IT department to create backdoors for illicit fund transfers? Or when you, Mr. Alden, personally approved the Cayman accounts that received untaxed millions from questionable investors? She laid a thick, bound dossier on the podium. This contains 7 years of my life. 7 years you stole, and 2 years of meticulously gathered evidence detailing every fraudulent transaction, every lie, every crime you've committed. It details how you framed me, Eleanor Vance, your former chief accountant, to take the fall for an embezzlement scheme that was merely the tip of your criminal iceberg. She said her name, Eleanor Vance, and a wave of recognition, of shock, spread through those who remembered the scandal. Marcus was sputtering, his face crimson. David looked like he was about to faint. The authorities have been provided with a copy of this dossier, Eleanor announced calmly, along with live access to your impenetrable system, which, as it turns out, isn't so impenetrable when the person you framed happens to be a forensic accountant with a vendetta and a very particular set of skills. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. As if on cue, the main doors of the conference hall burst open, and uniformed police officers, accompanied by stern-faced individuals in FBI jackets, streamed into the room. The chaos reached a crescendo. Marcus Alden lunged, not at Eleanor, but as if to flee, only to be met by two unyielding officers. David Fletcher simply sagged, defeated, his face ashen. Eleanor watched as they were cuffed, their power suits suddenly looking ill-fitting and pathetic. She saw the shock and anger on the faces of the shareholders, the people whose trust they had so thoroughly abused. It wasn't triumph she felt. Not exactly. It was a profound, almost solemn sense of closure. The ledger was finally being balanced. The fallout was spectacular. The Alden Rowe scandal, as the media dubbed it, dominated headlines for months. The evidence Eleanor had compiled was airtight. Marcus Alden and David Fletcher, facing a mountain of charges ranging from fraud and embezzlement to money laundering and obstruction of justice, received lengthy prison sentences in the very same federal system where Eleanor had spent her lost years. Their ill-gotten gains were seized, their reputations irrevocably destroyed. Alden Rowe Holdings collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, its assets liquidated to compensate defrauded investors. Eleanor Vance was publicly exonerated. The governor issued a formal apology and a full pardon. Her story became a symbol of resilience and the relentless pursuit of justice. Offers poured in. Law firms, private investigation agencies, even government task forces wanted her expertise. She accepted a position as head of forensic investigations at a prestigious and notably ethical rival firm. They weren't just hiring her for her skills. They were hiring her for her integrity, the very thing Marcus and David had tried to strip from her. Sometimes, sitting in her new, spacious office, overlooking the city skyline, Eleanor would think back to that dark cell in Danbury. She'd lost 7 years of her life, a loss she could never truly recover. But she had reclaimed her name, her honor, and her future. She had faced her demons and emerged not just a survivor, but a victor. The Phoenix Ledger, as she privately called the dossier that had brought her justice, was now a closed book. But its lessons remained. Trust, she knew, was a precious commodity, easily broken and painfully rebuilt. And numbers, indeed, never lied. Especially when wielded by a framed accountant who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Her revenge hadn't just been sweet, it had been meticulously accounted for.